Welcome everyone to this session. Thank you very much for Charleston Conference for inviting us here at lunchtime, and to my panelists, who I will introduce later. We are recording this session, so you'll all get a copy of it. Also, this webinar is based on a survey that we did with, first of all, my name is Bob Banerjee, part of your marketing team here at Ex Libris in North America. During the summer of 2020, we did our second annual survey together with Library Journal, which covered academic libraries across US and Canada. And we put all those results into a document. So we have a 2019 version, then we just did the 2020 survey, as I mentioned. And today's webinar is where I've invited my three guests to help me understand and interpret from their perspectives what those numbers mean to them. So with that, I'm going to ask Matt, John, and Elijah to introduce themselves briefly so you can get to know them. Matt?
Hi, yeah, my name is Matt Lechner. I'm the director of the library at City University of Seattle. I've filled sort of a number of roles there, coming up through resource sharing and e-resources. And so, yeah, I'm excited to talk to you today about these surveys in what's a pretty unusual time.
Thank you very much, Matt. John.
Hi, I'm John White. I'm the Dean of Libraries at the College of Charleston. I've been Dean or Interim Dean for about 8 years. And before that, I was an Archivist, Department Head and Associate Dean, all at the College of Charleston.
Fabulous, and thanks for making it all this way. Elijah.
Good morning, I'm Elijah Scott. I am the Executive Director of the Florida Academic Library Services Cooperative. We are a consortium in the state of Florida where we serve the 40 public colleges and universities across the state. So we have 40 different institutions, over 153 libraries serving about 1.8 million students.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining me. Let's get straight into it. If I can just click properly. There we go. So the first slide, there are about 10 slides I'm going to pull up, and each one I'm going to ask each of you in turn to make a comment on it. The first one is about the 5-year outlook. On the left-hand side, we see an ARL chart that I reused from last year, which shows over the previous 3 decades, the academic library typically receiving a smaller and smaller percentage of the university budget. So that was a continuous decline. Last year, over on the right-hand side, you'd see 2019 numbers in blue and 2020 in gold, or whatever that color is. For the first time last year, we saw some optimism. We saw that the people were saying it's going to level off. There's not going to be equal numbers said it would decline, as would say it would level off, as would say they expected it to grow. This was for the first time in 30 years. Unsurprisingly, 20% said it would shrink last year, but 76% are saying it would shrink this year. We ran this survey during the middle of the summer, so we delayed it a little bit because of the onset of the pandemic. We didn't want that to suddenly overwhelm the results. But John, your comments on this?
Well, I have to say, I'm a little shocked even pre-COVID that there was any confidence of the leveling off. You know, if there's one thing I think libraries need to begin to pay more and more attention to, it's issues of enrollment management on their campuses. And if you look at the data on new college students, enrolling over the next decade or so, what you see is that it's not just plateauing. The number of potential college students, the number of 18 to 22-year-olds seems to be diminishing, and most colleges are expecting an overall enrollment in higher education to dip between now and the early 2030s. Given that most colleges now get almost all of their funding through tuition, that really doesn't bode well for many colleges and their ability to actually bring in resources to fund libraries. So, I think overall that, that pessimism is well placed unless libraries can begin to find ways to make effective arguments on their own campuses about their value. When you compound that with the issue of the serials crisis and the ever increasing cost of providing library materials, it's simply unsustainable in the way that most college presidents are openly talking about now, that the ever-increasing tuition increases are unsustainable. So libraries really, I think, are going to have to begin to make a compelling argument and be involved on their own campuses of issues of enrollment management, recruitment, and retention, focusing on student success, and really sell themselves to their universities and the larger higher ed community as a really important part of driving tuition dollars into the institution. Otherwise, we really do risk this trend continuing at least into the 2030s as that demographic cliff leads us to a drop in enrollment.
Thank you very much. Elijah, before I hand it over to you, I should have mentioned that there were 233 respondents to this survey, and it covered everyone from doctoral granting universities down to associate universities. And I will provide a link to the report. You can go to our booth and download the original report, including all the charts supporting it. Elijah, what would you add here?
It's interesting to look at the chart on the left, and of course the letters are far too small for me to read on the screen, but we can easily spot the Great Recession. That stands out clearly as we follow that line down. And so I think that probably we are looking at another time period where we're going to see a similar drop. For the academic libraries that FALSI works with, all of whom are state funded, we know that we're going to see a dramatic drop in state funding already for this fiscal year. We've been told that across the 40 institutions, there's a 6% holdback of the state funding for their budgets. That number is very likely to increase as we work through the rest of this budget year. So they've been told to plan for an increase to perhaps an 8% or even a 10% holdback of the budget. And then in looking forward to the next fiscal year, again, our institutions are being told to expect additional cuts for that fiscal year as well, as the overall state budget feels the lasting impacts of the economic shortfalls caused by the current pandemic. So we know that state funding is going to continue to be a challenge. And then John mentioned the issue of tuition funding that combines with that. So for our state funded institutions, they're seeing a two-pronged impact of a reduction of state funding combined with enrollment numbers that are either flat or in some cases declining. And so the tuition dollars will continue to decrease as well. All of that, of course, trickles right down to the library budgets. And so I agree with what John was saying. It's incumbent upon all of us to find every way that we can to measure what we're doing in our libraries and connect those measurements directly to measurements on student success and student retention. So this is just going to continue to be the challenge. I have to say that I'm in that 76% of the survey respondents who expect the net shrink, and certainly we're seeing that pretty dramatically here in Florida.
Got it. Matt.
Yeah, so speaking from an institution reliant completely on tuition rather than state funding, we certainly feel that very directly. I think that the pessimism versus optimism is interesting when we look at alternative ways to provide the same resources that we historically have. For example, City University is part of a system, as I know that many of you are as well, and looking for ways to consolidate subscriptions and take advantage of being in consortia or even systems of universities. I think it does take away the feeling of individual institutional budget, so that could cause pessimism. But at the same time, I think that there is certainly potential for savings in some of those areas.
Thank you very much. Let's move on then to priorities. So in this question, I simply asked everyone, what are your priorities for 2020? And unsurprisingly, student retention is way up there. Observers might be surprised, why is student retention on a library-oriented survey? I was trying to combine two things really in this survey: what's important to the institution and what's important to the library, and see if there was any overlap. I highlighted three things here: the importance of student retention, how important research, teaching students research and information skills is, and the significance of distance teaching and learning. I myself have two kids in college right now, and they're both doing that. I highlighted those three, but I invite you, Elijah, you can go first, to pick any cell and just comment on it, because we could spend an hour on this particular slide.
Sure, and I think actually those first two cells, student retention and then teach students research and information skills, those two are inextricably intertwined. We know that retention is going to be critical as time goes by. That's how we ensure that for the health of the institution, by retaining those students, you're retaining funding, whether it's directly through tuition dollars or that combination of tuition dollars and state funding. Retention of existing students is critical. Retaining them from semester to semester and then retaining them through completion of a degree or certificate, whatever pathway they're pursuing, that's critical. So how does the library contribute directly to that specific mission? And I would propose that it's through the teaching work that we do in our libraries. The collections, of course, are critical, and there's no question about that. But the best way for the academic library to show to the institution, to say to the administration of the institution, here's the value that this institution sees for the dollars that are given to the library budget. The best way we can show that value is through that teaching activity that we do in teaching students how to do research, how to find, evaluate, analyze information, and then apply that knowledge to their work and their courses. So there's just no way that libraries can continue to operate without striving to make new efforts to show the impact on retention. So I think those first two cells are just inextricably intertwined.
Fantastic. And we do have a few minutes later on to unpack the changing, evolving role of the library. So we will get to that. Matt.
Yes, I'm thrilled to see retention so high on the list, and I wish that were always reflected in institutional efforts. I think that retention needs to be much more highly prioritized in many institutions rather than strictly enrollment. Obviously, the library is a huge contributor to student retention in terms of the services that libraries support. Libraries are also expanding into more than just the traditional sort of reference provision activities, and doing academic technology, curriculum development, all of this sort of thing. So I would say the other cell that I would really highlight is affordable learning, and I know that we'll get back to that later. But that is also a really high priority for our library, and I think another opportunity for libraries to show their value by providing resources that can be used in courses, that can be used as required materials, that save students dollars out of their pocket. Now, that's sometimes trickier to sell because it doesn't directly impact the tuition on the balance sheets of the university. However, what we're seeing, and I know that many others are seeing, is that students come to really appreciate that level of support and saving dollars on resources that they can get through the library. Not to mention, librarians are continuing to expand their ability to support just the selection and publication of those course resources, which just gives back time to the instructors.
I'm glad you highlighted affordable learning. As I said, I have two kids. One's doing business and law, and the other one's doing mechanical engineering at college. But I don't understand. We pay, as parents, we pay tens of thousands a year for our kids to go to college. But for some reason, when there's a $100 or $200 charge on a book or some course materials, for some reason that pinches in a different way. So anything we can do to help on that. John.
Sure. I mean, I think I would really support everything that's been said by Matt and Elijah. But I think you can take whether it's student retention or the student engagement, and the support of the institution's mission, and wrap all of those together. Because if you look at any college president and the things they're saying out loud, you're going to hear about student recruitment, retention, and success. the student-centric university, every new strategic plan being adopted by these college presidents and by universities, that's going to be front and center because they're largely written by the same university consultant cartels that sort of go around the country and hold these webinars, and things like EAB are really pushing this message with good reason, following the data. And for libraries to be successful, we really have to be able to capture some of that information and quantify it and its value to the university. And I know at the College of Charleston, one of the ways we're doing this, we've talked about the instruction success, and we'll talk a little bit more about library content and collection development later. But we have a Library 105, a 1-credit information literacy course, and we know that the students who enroll in that elective course at the College of Charleston come in less prepared for college. If you look at the data, they have lower SAT scores, lower high school GPAs, they're less prepared for university level work, and yet the students who take that course have about a 10% higher 4- and 6-year graduation rate at the College of Charleston. That is a quantifiable piece of information that we can use to demonstrate the library's ability to improve student retention and success. It speaks the language of our presidents. It sells our library on our campus. And I think the ability to capture meaningful data, not just tell good, feel good stories or talk about the value of libraries in a qualitative sense, is going to be really critical for us moving forward.
Beautiful, well put, quantified. Moving on, I asked institutions, or rather we asked institutions, what are your big challenges? And the 3 columns on the right reflect the 3 different sizes of broad range of institutions, less than 5,000 FTE, 5 to 20K, and then 20K and up. I highlighted a few items there. I thought that funding cuts was more extreme for larger institutions, and I couldn't understand why. Staff shortages was also more acute at larger institutions. Any cells stand out for you, Matt?
I think the staff shortages is a significant one, and I know that libraries have many libraries have gotten smaller in staff, all the while expected to continue to innovate and compete. I know that just our electronic and technical services department has shrunk from 6 to 3, and yet I think that's really tied to these cells farther down on this list, the inadequate IT systems, discovery resources, inadequate insight to resource usage. So the sorts of analyses that John is talking about inherently take interpretation and time to staff time to set up. So I think that there are obviously some huge parallels between the cells here, the staff shortages, and the increasing need to demonstrate value with fewer people. That's a huge challenge.
Thanks, Matt. Elijah.
As a director at a consortium, I'll say I'm very happy to see that consortial politics so far down on the list. I'm glad that's not toward the top of that list. But I also think that staff shortages, that's going to be one of the biggest challenges, especially over the next couple of years. We're already talking about the funding cuts, about the challenges that funding will present for the institution as a whole, and then specifically for our libraries. Typically, when there are funding cuts, when there are budget challenges, any open positions will be frozen. We know from seeing media in our field that there's talk of layoffs and furloughs at different institutions. So staff shortages, I think, is really going to be the most pressing problem. And it's also interesting for me, kind of thinking longitudinally, looking at where lack of physical space falls on this chart now. And so it's further down than I think it would have been in previous years. And that reflects the shift of collections in our libraries as we're moving away from print and moving more towards electronic. The pressure to have sufficient physical space, that pressure I think is eased up. Libraries are not facing that challenge so much, and the survey reflects this. But that means that, as we've been talking about all of the issues around retention and how libraries show the value of that, it's so important that we have not just the positions for staff, but we have the right people in those positions, that we have the best staff that we possibly can, so that our libraries then are best serving our students. And we can make all these connections that we're talking about between the work that's being done in our libraries and meeting the overall mission of the institution. So staff shortages really is the challenge that leaps out to me.
Got it. John, I'll ask you to pick an area, but maybe you could also add for me, what does it mean if I have to reduce staff? What happens to the services? What typically gets hit?
So, I think one of the points of focus that we're going to see is, if you look at the Great Recession and after 2008, we were all worried about budget cuts largely related to materials, the increasing inflation with budget cuts. And one of the ways that many libraries were able to deal with that was through the creative and wonderful work of well-trained librarians. And we were able to do things like intense cost of use analysis. We were able to really get in there and figure out the best way to squeeze the most benefit out of every dollar. We were able to come up with creative resources and resource sharing through large consortium, all kinds of different ways to do that work. But all of that depends on high quality, well-trained librarians with the support they need doing this important work. So if I have one real concern, the impact of all of these things is going to be that what we call a library, which is really just a community of people who are using the library and running the library and communicating in different ways, that is really going to suffer. And you can cover up a lot of losses in buying materials for the library through resource sharing and really good librarianship, really well-trained librarians who can help students and faculty figure out ways to get what they need. If you begin to lose those people who are so critical to the success of both faculty and students on the campus, you can't come back from that. And so I think the impacts of some of these funding cuts and furloughs and layoffs, really has enormous potential to do damage to libraries that were able to do really good work in the last round of budget cuts because of the people who work there and run the place. So I think that's the biggest impact we have to look at. And my biggest concern now really is, the loss of staff is meaningful for students and faculty on a campus. It's meaningful for the life of the university, and it's particularly a problem for students who struggle and student success overall.
Thank you very much. In a couple of slides, we're going to be talking about things that could potentially adapt or impact the role of the library. So we'll see if it can expand in certain ways. Let's move on then. We should be able to run through this very quickly. We asked people around the shift from physical to digital, where are you going to we asked them, where are you going to shift your budget next year? So these are the items, and whether it was going to net reduce, that means reduce slightly or reduce a lot. And over on the right-hand side, increase a little bit or increase a lot. And we saw the main increases being around improved instructional technology and obviously digital resources. Then at the bottom left, net reduction in physical resources, probably unsurprisingly, and staffing. But I also noticed a significant stability in people continuing to invest in migrating to the cloud, so whatever initiatives they have there, and around resource sharing. Elijah, why don't you run with this first?
Sure, and I think it's pretty interesting to look at that dramatic contrast between the net increase of 36.1% for acquiring digital resources and then the net reduction of almost 87% in acquiring physical resources. And I think that's just reflective of a general trend in libraries. I remember probably 10 or so years ago, maybe a little bit longer, I was at a conference and the question was asked about of library directors in the room, what percentage of the budget was allocated for print and what percentage was allocated for digital. And I spoke up and gave the numbers for the library I worked at, which at that point in time was about 65% digital and about 35% print. And there was this collective gasp around the room that we were allocating that much for digital. It kind of surprised me, but we see from this information that that really is the current trend. And this, I think, also relates back to some of the other issues that we've talked about. We know that many of our students now are not the traditional four-year students living on campus in a dorm. We know many of our students are doing much of their work from home or from wherever they are, because they're doing much of the coursework online. We have to make sure that our libraries provide the right resources to meet them in that space wherever they are on the planet and whatever point in time it is that they're doing their work. So of course, we're continuing to shift to digital resources. And then also thinking about our physical spaces. We've already identified that we don't expect to see where we haven't identified pressure to increase those physical spaces. Clearly, in the budget environment we're in, we're not going to see budget dollars allocated to increasing physical spaces. We're not going to see massive building projects. I don't think we'll even see massive renovation projects in academic libraries over the next few years. So there's just not space to acquire and place new physical resources. So we have to continue to place an emphasis on acquiring digital resources. And again, I would argue that acquiring digital resources, that's the best place that we can put our scarce budget dollars to ensure that those resources are most readily available to our students.
Got it. John.
Well, I think like everything else in the pandemic, as we all meet here on Zoom, as opposed to in person, what we're seeing is it's accelerating trends that were already in place. And I know at the College of Charleston, we had really shifted to e-preferred, and the impact of the pandemic and the learn from anywhere model and remote learning models or hybrid learning models are just accelerating that into a, everything unless you have an extremely good reason why you need it physically. And this plays in also to affordable learning and other things as well. So, some of these trends, I really think what you're seeing is an acceleration based on the fact that, the library is now not just, the building. And we could have said that same thing 10 years ago, that the virtual spaces of the library are absolutely as critical as the physical spaces. But we've certainly seen the impact of that. And I think if you talk with library directors who have had to make that everyone's favorite word, pivot, to e-learning, so rapidly in the spring, the libraries that had invested in a sort of learn from anywhere and access model where you shifted from acquiring to providing access to, those libraries were able to shift much more quickly and much more effectively to remote learning in March and April than libraries that had not effectively made that shift.
No doubt. Matt.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think that even institutions that already had that capacity to teach online to students anywhere, I think that there was still sort of collective surprise among some, administrators that transition through the start of the pandemic was as smooth as it, people were continuing to do what they had been doing, which is provide high quality services online and supporting students online. So I think that I was surprised at some people's surprise that was as effective as it was. Our library is 98% digital, and really we're starting to look at migrating to the cloud to address in various systems, to address some of the staff shortage issues, some of the reliability issues, network security, and all of that. So yeah, it really does seem that digital resources are not only the best way to provide services to scattered student populations, but they also seem in many cases to be effective at, like we've talked about before, using the dollars that we have most effectively, sometimes allowing students to have a say in what gets used, either through triggers, or rather than just buying huge digital collections just for the sake of having them.
Excellent, thank you. We are at the halfway mark and we're doing beautifully, so let's move on. We asked people, so when the virus hit the fan back in the glorious spring of 2020, lessons were learned, things happened, lessons were learned. How likely are institutions to actually do something about what they actually learned rather than just talk about it? John, why don't you talk about what you or your peers at other institutions might be thinking in terms of, as a result of this, we need to pivot?
So I think the big thing that we learned was that some of our efforts to essentially adopt the library is everywhere model and to emphasize, virtual spaces as important as our physical spaces, and virtual services as important as our physical services, pre-pandemic really paid off. The things like making sure that for our teaching librarians, for example, that distance ed training was mandatory. Things like making everyone use the same mechanism for students to schedule research consultations using LibCal and other things, making all of those things uniform and mandatory and well spelled out with clear direction on our website really paid off and have made us feel like we made some really smart decisions there. The other thing that is maybe a little counterintuitive is, as everyone else seems to be contracting, sort of technical services at their institutions as a result of budget cuts after the Great Recession, we really invested in that area to the point of converting multiple staff lines into faculty appointments, with the notion that if we rebuilt, what we now call collections and content services, focused on sort of metadata and access and hardcore data analysis and collection about how people are using our library, that we could stretch our dollars more effectively. And those decisions that we actually made pre-pandemic made our transition to remote learning, which was a really small part of the College of Charleston. Distance ed was only about 3% of the courses in a given semester, and then so we're up to over 30 now, and the rest are all in a hybrid learning model. We were able to make that transition incredibly quickly, and I think that that system of being ready to have a library everywhere with a uniform way of accessing it, making sure everyone's well trained, are important. But I also think we learned that cutting and hacking and slashing away at technical services where you can't make really informed decisions and collect incredibly useful data about how people use your collections makes things like affordable learning projects much more difficult.
Thank you. Elijah.
So we're making some changes in two primary ways that I can think of. One thing internally within our organization, within the consortia, we've all been working remotely since March. It's still startling to me to think about the fact that I have not physically walked into my office since March. No, I don't keep a China hutch in my office. And yet everything is going along smoothly. In fact, our consortium is in the midst of an ILS migration and implementation for 40 institutions. We've been doing that work since March without any meetings or conversations or anything in person, and everything is still on track, on schedule, on progress. So we're already having conversations within the organization about, okay, when this is over and we return to normal, whatever normal is going to look like when all this is over, how will our organization function? Do we need to make some changes in structure and physical space and how we expect people to work and do their work? So we're already having some of those conversations. But then thinking about how we serve our libraries from the consortium, we do manage the ILS for all 40 institutions. We also manage an authentication platform for the electronic resources for these institutions and other resources as well. We already had been talking with the libraries about how can we work with you to help you use the data that we sort of hold in terms of student usage of resources, in terms of student access. How can we work with the libraries to help you understand that data, make use of it to tell the stories about student success and student retention? We're really accelerating those conversations to try to do more of that work so that as we continue to work through the budget impacts of the pandemic and then further on down the road, making sure that we are best serving our libraries by enabling them to make the best use of the resources that we provide to them. So two major pivots that we're working on.
Thank you very much. And Matt, why don't you wrap it up for me?
Yeah, I would definitely echo Elijah's observations that we launched a new course resources management system in the spring. Ex Libris Leganto, as it happens, and I fully expected there to be months of sitting in a little small breakout room with the key players and figuring it out, but that was all done virtually and at a good time, as it turns out. So we actually, every single course at CityU uses the course resource management system for all required resources. And that sort of level of management has been very timely for, with the pandemic. We're also looking similarly at, what does return look like? And again, accelerating the trends that were already there, as John mentioned. We've long wondered at the difference between site operations and sort of a front desk library service area, and looking at physical space and how we can maybe even collapse those two sort of formerly disparate parts of the university, site operations and library services front desk. And so not just thinking about when we go back, but how we go back and how the physical space might even look different.
Thank you. Since you brought up course materials, Matt, you can go first next. So when we looked at the priorities, if you remember a few slides ago, a couple of the pretty high priorities are listed there around teaching and learning, supporting distance teaching and learning, as well as providing course materials. Now, as you mentioned, Leganto is one of the Ex Libris products that helps you with reading lists, but it will fail unless faculty are persuaded, since we have video cameras, I can say persuaded, to embed links to library assets inside the learning management system so that those assets are used inside the classroom. So unless you have the reading solution, unless you encourage the faculty to use the LMS, which not everyone does, and easily search the library to find out what assets can be used in the classroom, Leganto will not work. But in those cases where that is done, it is extremely successful. And over the summer, we had an initiative where we invited people to try and use Leganto, and there was a huge surge in the adoption of Leganto over the summer. People rushing to make their electronic assets available in the classroom. Any comments about that?
Yes, definitely. So CityU is a little bit unique in that we do have a centralized curriculum development model, and we previously had a course resources management system that was centralized. So the concept of it was not new to our faculty, but we've just seen some really huge advances in the way that faculty do use it. And I would really highlight again the easy integration of library resources into course materials and reading lists. But also, it's not just, we can indirectly improve the student experience by improving the faculty experience. And I think that allowing the library to help with the support and management of course resources is very much appreciated by our faculty, who themselves are looking, at shrinking numbers of administrative staff. We found that we can fix broken links a lot faster. Taking links out of the LMS, paradoxically, is what we're looking to accomplish. The LMS can become littered with links that, directly to resources that change. I mean, permalinks, they might be permanent to the provider, but they're not necessarily permanent when you discontinue your subscription. So we're finding that having links in Leganto or in a central place like that the library can help manage is hugely beneficial to both faculty and students. Plus, it corrals all the endless communication about these decisions and resources into a single place rather than being far-flung in lost emails.
Difficult question to answer, Matt. Having a solution like Leganto or a reading list solution which leverages your library assets in the classroom, does it actually make a difference to people's perception of the value of the library, or is it just, it's nice to have?
To students, it undoubtedly does. I think that the ease of integration of library resources, and then the just available through your library link on your official reading list page for the course is a huge value to students. So items that students need to borrow, we will, to purchase, we will show a sort of a site that gives you the different prices available for that item. But we really do try, what we're investing our dollars in is to find electronic versions of texts in unlimited user licenses and put them into Leganto. And our students are really grateful. It's just like you said with, it's those $200 and $300 textbooks that for some reason really do pinch.
It does. John, what about at the College of Charleston?
So we're still sort of in the middle of implementing Leganto, and we haven't got to see the end result. But one of the things that we do know is that in order to both sell the value of the library on campus, but also to collect the relevant data that we need to make smart decisions about collection development and other things, and understand the resources that our faculty are using, that they need from us, and to understand what our students need from us. We really need the faculty assigning the materials, using the materials. We need the students to have easy and clear access pathways to those materials. And then we need to be able to collect all of that data very easily so that we can then use it to continue to make smart decisions about how we spend our students' money. All of that becomes easier when you have a solution like Leganto, or at least that is our hope. And we've seen enough evidence in just use of our existing LMS and other things to be confident that will help. On top of that, you just get the ease of use and the sort of student-centered approach about putting all of these things in one place, which if you talk to any student, they really appreciate and they're used to in their home lives, the way that they use technology, whether they're in sort of the Google camp or Apple camp.
Thank you. Let's move swiftly on then. When we asked people, how important is affordable learning to you? Almost everyone said, yeah, it's super important. And I guess that was a bit of a duh question. But when we looked at comparing it to, hang on a minute. So it's very important, but almost 60% said that the library is only slightly or not involved. Any comments on that? John, why don't you go first?
I think everyone immediately sort of goes to things like open textbooks, and there's a lot of data, and universities have shown when they've adopted strong OER programs, they can save students hundreds or even thousands of dollars a year in textbook costs. The one area that I'm really focused on is in collection development and different content management strategies. The understanding of how many licenses we need for different resources that are often used to teach, in the curriculum, I think is an area where libraries really can make a better case for themselves on our campus. That it isn't just about open textbooks and some of the tools that have now been around for a long time. It's also about strategic use of our money toward licensing and access. We never would have bought 40 copies of the same book 15 years ago, but sometimes it's a smart decision to buy a license where 40 students can access a book at the same time. And you can make a compelling case for library budgets on your campus doing that.
Matt?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. And I think that what we're finding so far is that, not only does Leganto make things easier and more seamless for faculty and students, and allows librarians to support that process with making sure the metadata is correct, doing that behind the scenes and then publication support. But also it is, as John mentions, it's able to show engagement of students with the resources. So if students are not reading, this particular book, which you can see in Leganto Analytics, that tells the instructor something, and it ultimately tells the library something. Sometimes things become very unexpectedly popular. And not that collection development decisions should be based solely on popularity. However, I think that being able to see data about student engagement with course resources is just sort of a whole new ability, and it adds, I think, to the data points that we already have. Students' engagement with information literacy in the LMS, for example, that the librarians create, and what effect that has on their success. So yeah, I think showing the value of the library, it can only help to have that sort of information.
Elijah, we're starting to get lower on time, but I'm going to ask you a very specific question. So on that bottom right-hand chart, green and gold, that adds up to just under 60%. Are you personally surprised that even though almost everyone says affordable learning, super important, up at the top left, 60% of us say, yeah, we're actually not doing much to help. Are you surprised?
I am a little surprised by that, and I gave some thought to that. So I came into the affordable learning conversation, I think around 2013, really. I was working as the library director at the time, and it was very much, that movement was very much at that time centered in the library. So I was a little surprised at seeing this now, but I think what has happened is that over the past 5 to 7 years, the affordable learning community is very much matured, and the availability of the resources has increased, the findability of the resources has increased. So I think that while we all still say it's a priority, and we understand that because of the connections to student success, to student retention and so forth, our involvement directly from libraries may have backed off a little bit, because it's so much easier now for faculty to find the materials, for faculty to integrate them into the courses and things like that. So I think that may be a partial explanation of that. And very quickly, because I know we're tight on time, the other thing I like to remind libraries of when we talk about affordable learning, it's not just the textbooks. If you think about it, everything in the library is there to support affordable learning. And I give the example of, let's say hypothetically, we said the average cost of a scholarly journal article would be $30 per article. Well, that freshman comp paper that requires 10 sources could cost $300 if the student had to go out there and find those 10 articles and pay for them on their own. So it's not just the textbooks, it's everything that we have in the library. It's all there for affordable learning. And as we're in this age of increasing budget constraints, I think it's important for all of us in libraries to remind our institutions, and to remind the administrations at our institutions that that's really why we exist.
Got it. Thank you. Thank you for that. John, I'm just going to ask you to comment on this slide, and then we'll move on. I asked the same question in 2019, that's blue versus gold, which is 2020. We asked, who's taking the initiative? Who's the leader on campus in terms of affordable learning initiatives? And it was amazing. 35% or so said it was a library, very, very closely, almost neck and neck with the provost office, and then everyone else rode off into the sunset. But what appears to be happening in this 2020 survey is that the library is saying we are pulling back, and the provost office is pulling back, and that has converted down to the bottom of increased uncertainty. Any insight as to why, or is this just a reflection of uncertain budgets or tighter budgets or COVID, or what?
So I think this and things like supporting research and other big ticket items that take enormous faculty buy-in really have to be institutional decisions. And at most universities, for the academic enterprise, that means through your academic affairs office and the provost. That, I think we've all been in the case, in situations where the library had some amazing resource, or we had some amazing service, and we're unbelievably frustrated that no one showed up to use it. And for these things to work, and I think this is why you're seeing the part of the reason you're seeing the shift go to the provost office. You have to have widespread buy-in from the people who are the first line of introduction to, of academic material to students, and those are the faculty members teaching all the classes from English and business and everything else. So I actually think this is a good thing because it means that institutions are buying in on this. And I can really only speak to the College of Charleston, but I think we would find this to be universal. One of the sort of unsung roles of the provost is dealing with the mountain of parent complaints that come into every university about all things academic. And slowly creeping up to the top of that list for many people is the cost of textbooks, the cost of course materials, in addition to spiraling sort of tuition costs. So I think you're also seeing the impact of that here. And again, this, when a lot of provosts are looking for people to solve their problems in this area, the library can be a real partner.
Lovely. Let's move on to my last two topics. Fantastic job, gentlemen, in helping me with this. Resource sharing. So we asked the report gives a breakdown of not only the demographics, but the job role or title of the people that were responding. But what are your big problems when it comes to resource sharing? Because that's something we at Ex Libris are very focused on right now. And there were two or three really huge things. One is it takes too long and it's too expensive, in blunt words. Matt, your comments on that?
Yeah, so I would say that the costs related to these resource sharing activities, being creative with those expenses, and not looking for ways beyond just IFM or just the sort of traditional ways of funding resource sharing, whether that's drop shipping to a student from Canadian Amazon, or whether that's looking at individual license to an article and just sending it, looking at the costs as what makes the most sense rather than just what we've always done with resource sharing. Also, I think that imbalance of interlibrary loan borrowing versus lending, that's something that is a concern, at least for us. And fortunately, we kept all of our Eric Fish when everyone threw theirs away. So that's sort of our bread and butter with lending. But again, it's being remote and being away from our libraries that certainly takes a toll on some of the resource sharing activities, and even more encourages alternative ways to spend those dollars.
I'm not sure if either of the three of you are Rapid ILL users or not. Is anyone a Rapid ILL user? Yes, you are, College of Charleston. Elijah, why don't you add something, and then I'll ask John to chip in there.
Sure, and I think the cost and the length of time are both still challenges for resource sharing. So for FALTC, within our consortium, we provide a consortial catalog for students to access the contents of all 40 institutions simultaneously, and we also provide a unmediated borrowing system. So when students are searching that universal catalog, they find something that they need from a different institution, it's very easy for them to request and receive that. Last academic year, we had more than 3 million borrows across the system. So our students clearly do place a high priority on this service. It's interesting because as a result of the pandemic, there was a period of time this year where we had to suspend that service. We had to stop it temporarily for a few months, and we've restarted it. And as soon as we restarted it, we saw activity begin almost immediately. So we know that students really place a priority on that physical resource sharing. I think our next big challenge, and this is probably true for many consortia, is to really find some new and cost-effective ways to do more electronic resource sharing. That's still a challenge across our consortia, where certain institutions may license an electronic resource, others don't. How to best navigate those challenges of licensing will be our next big frontier in this area.
Got it. Thank you. John, I know this is unscripted, but would you mind chipping in on what Rapid ILL means to your borrowers or your lenders in reference to these priorities?
Well, I think, one thing I think librarians understand more than almost anyone else on campus, except for maybe the registrar's office when grades are due, is that our faculty aren't really that much better at time management than our students. And when you combine all of that together, the ability to acquire things quickly, the ability to lend things quickly is critical, because our students and our faculty, as we all know, can't wait around typically for a week or more for resources. So it does make a key difference. If you're a net lender like the College of Charleston, you invest staff time in this, and it really makes an impact in building strong partnerships with other libraries, and then you hope to get those things in return. But speed is critical, especially at a time where I'm always reminded of my children have an inability to not watch the cartoons they want to watch when they want to watch them. And we've now raised an entire generation that when they want something, they just press a button and it's there. What do you mean we have to wait for even through a commercial? I mean, our students don't wait through a 2-minute commercial break anymore. They're certainly not going to be patient when it comes to getting something when the paper's due tomorrow that they started writing at 10 p.m. the night before.
And how are your stats, John? I'm not asking whether you have the stats right off the top of your head, but are you looking at well within 24-hour turnaround times now?
We are, and a lot of that I will say, Brandon Luter, who is our, runs our interlibrary loan shop, along with, Liza Gadsden and some of our other staff members. They're quite competitive. I mean, in how quickly they can get things. So, usually we can get them pretty quickly. I mean, if it's typically within 48, and a lot of times we can get it within 24.
It's absolutely fantastic, amazing stuff. Okay, last slide then. Supporting research. Right at the beginning, we were talking about how can we expand, how can we defend against this incoming pressure on the library? And one of the areas that we've touched on is in teaching and learning, bringing our assets into the classroom, making it more valuable. The other one is in supporting research. So we asked people, how important are these various things? And there are the numbers. Elijah, why don't you tackle this one first? What do you think?
Sure. Clearly, supporting access to scholarly sources, especially for researchers, is extraordinarily high priority for all of our libraries, but especially at research-intensive institutions. We also know that grant funding is a top priority for research faculty, and I think the pressure to secure grant funding may increase as other budget sources are decreasing and dwindling. So access to those scholarly sources is critical. This just reinforces the importance for our libraries to maintain robust digital collections and efficient resource sharing, as we've talked about previously, but also this gives an important emphasis on something else from the survey, and that's the importance of the institutional research repository. It's not just preservation of the results of the research, but also the preservation of and access to the data sets. Often access to the data sets is required by the terms of grant funding. It's also incredibly useful to other researchers, but we see that data sets can often kind of get lost in the scholarly publishing life cycle, where the emphasis is placed on the results of the research. But the data sets may not have a place to live. There's a lack of storage for them. It's difficult to find them, or even if you can find the data, in some cases the software is obsolete, so it's impossible for researchers to make any use of the data. So I think the ways that we can really support our scholars in this area is not just access to the scholarly content, but also to the preservation of the research and the data.
Got it. Thank you. And Matt, while I ask you to answer, I'm going to put a link in the chat window for our guests to visit the booth afterwards to download the PDF. So why don't you take it away?
Yes, I would definitely, say that providing access to scholarly sources is very high priority, but I would also add that, as has been discussed, that just providing access to scholarly sources without, the information literacy and without the outreach to show the value and to show the resources that the library does provide, I think it's not enough to just provide them, because we do see, I think as John mentioned, we see some extremely valuable resources that are not fully utilized. And so that's sort of the second piece, I would say. The academic repository, we started one 5 or 6 years ago, you know, as an internal repository of scholarly work at CityU, and we've been just wildly surprised with the visibility and success of it externally. So I think that there is a demand for, you know, increased openness and sharing of research, and yeah, we've been thrilled with the success of that.
Thank you very much. John?
Well, you know, I'm going to, because we've all been so positive, be a little bit of a downer here. You know, I do think libraries, you need to be concerned about, you know, where they put their resources, particularly when it comes to personnel and librarians. That, you know, there are costs involved with data storage and data migration and long-term digital sustainability, that unless the institutions, and this is another one like affordable learning, that I feel like libraries are leading the way, but you have to win the institutional buy-in first. And I think some libraries have made a mistake of shifting resources to an area that they can't fully support without the buy-in of the institution. This is particularly, I think, true at smaller universities and universities like the College of Charleston that seem to fall in the middle and maybe facing some budget crunches right now. So I think, you know, supporting research means many, many things, but if we're talking about things like data management plans and storage and institutional repositories, that work needs to have a buy-in from the institution, and the institution needs to understand the cost of that work going into it. Otherwise, you could really find yourself in a situation where you have starved critical areas like, you know, collections and services in order to try to fund a new thing that you know is important, but that you don't have the resources from your institution to support.
Thank you so much. And with that, we are actually out of time. The Q&A, I will address the questions individually and get back to the people that have asked them. In the chat window, you'll see a link to our booth, so you can go and pick up a copy of the report or discuss any of the findings with people. And there's a very short survey there as well you can take. And with that, I'd like to thank Charleston Conference for having us, for you for attending, and to my panelists, Matt, John, and Elijah. Thank you very much for joining me. I much appreciate it. Thank you very much. Take care. Bye-bye.